Alright, so I decided to do my project on schizophrenia. So, what is schizophrenia? Oxford defines schizophrenia as a long-term mental disorder of a type involving a breakdown in the relation between thought, emotion, and behavior, leading to a faulty perception, inappropriate actions and feelings, withdrawal from reality, and personal relationships into fantasy and delusion, and a sense of mental fragmentation. But what exactly does that mean? Well, to begin, schizophrenia is a rare psychological disorder which affects less than 1% of the population. Symptoms of schizophrenia include, but are not limited to, hallucinations, delusions, and abnormal motor function. But wait, before we dig any deeper, we're going to need to take a brief history lesson on the story behind schizophrenia. Schizophrenia was discovered in 1877 by Dr. Emile Kraepelin, who was a German psychiatrist. Kraepelin managed to trace all the symptoms associated with schizophrenia and created the first formal description of the disease, though the term schizophrenia was not being used at this point. Kraepelin referred to the disorder as dementia precoce, which means early dementia, which was in fact a false assumption. We know now that they are two very distinct disorders. It wasn't until 1911 when Eugene Buehler coined the term schizophrenia, which comes from the Greek roots schizin, which means split, and phren, which means mind. Buehler argued that dementia was not a common symptom associated with schizophrenia, therefore suggesting the change of term. Buehler cared enough to write a letter in 1911 which settled the debate. The letter reads, "I call dementia precoce schizophrenia because I hope to show the splitting of the different psychic functions is one of its most important features. In each case, there is a more or less clear splitting of the psychological functions. As the disease becomes distinct, the personality loses its unity." Buehler argues that the disorder has more to do with the splitting of psychic functions rather than being associated with an early form of dementia. Aside from coming up with the name, Buehler was also the first to describe symptoms as either positive or negative when referring to schizophrenia. Now, earlier I spoke about how schizophrenia was not a common disease, and it's not. However, in the early days of scary insane asylums, there were tons of people being admitted for schizophrenia, most likely misdiagnosed, but if we look at this graph, we can see in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, there was a huge spike in admissions due to schizophrenia. Maybe it was a craze because it was something new and every doctor jumped to a conclusion when it came to diagnosis. Regardless, by the 1960s, the numbers started to drop, and now we see it as a rare disorder. So, what causes schizophrenia? Researchers are unsure of the exact cause, though studies suggest it could potentially be a number of factors which come into play. We do know that schizophrenia tends to run in families, but there is no specific gene which is associated with being responsible for it. Something I found interesting was that studies were done with identical twins, and researchers found that if one twin suffered from schizophrenia, then the other twin had a 50% chance of developing the disorder, regardless of all environmental factors. Studies also point to a connection between neurotransmitters and schizophrenia, suggesting an imbalance in serotonin and dopamine within the brain could be a leading factor to the disorder. Serotonin and dopamine are two chemicals which play a major role in regulating metabolism, memory, sleep, as well as emotional well-being. This correlation was discovered when researchers found that drugs which suppress neurotransmitters resulted in a relief of some symptoms for patients. Schizophrenia can develop at any point in life, and certain things may trigger schizophrenia for those who are at risk. These include large amounts of stress, such as losing a job, home, or loved one. Research has also found that while illegal drugs such as marijuana, cocaine, and LSD do not directly cause schizophrenia, they increase the likelihood to those who are already susceptible to developing the condition later in life. So, we got through all that. We know all this about schizophrenia. But what is it like in the mind of someone who suffers from schizophrenia? Remember Buehler, the guy who coined the term schizophrenia and came up with the positive and negative description of symptoms? This is where that comes into play. So, when speaking about the symptoms of schizophrenia, they fall into either a positive or negative category, and Buehler doesn't mean this in a good or bad way. The term positive and negative subdivide the symptoms into ones which basically add or subtract aspects of one's psyche. Let's explain that a little further. When referring to positive symptoms, these are things which schizophrenia adds to the affected individual. These include the symptoms which most of us associate with schizophrenia, such as hallucinations, delusions, and abnormal motor behavior, as mentioned before. Negative symptoms take away. They can be described as more of an absence of a quality rather than an addition. Negative symptoms include inexpressive and blank looks, monotone speech, a general lack of interest in people and the world, as well as an overall inability to feel happy or act spontaneously. Now, let's dig a little deeper to understand how these symptoms would affect the overall well-being of an individual, and what exactly someone who suffers from schizophrenia is potentially experiencing. A hallucination can be defined as an experience involving the apparent perception of something which is not present or real. A hallucination can be something you either see, hear, feel, or smell. These being referred to as visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory/gustatory hallucinations. Reports from individuals who suffer from schizophrenia say they see or have had encounters with strange things such as people or monster-like creatures that do not exist or don't make sense. These drawings I'm showing you were all created by people who suffer from schizophrenia. Individuals also hear things such as voices in their head, maybe whispering suggestions or yelling commands. They may feel things such as a hand or hands touching them, or perhaps insects crawling on them. Taste and smell also play a factor into these hallucinations. They can be as simple as smelling bacon when there is none cooking, or as difficult as having a patient who refuses to eat food because they believe they taste poison. And that leads us to our next point. The patient believed the food was poisoned. This is what we refer to as a delusion. A delusion is a persistent false psychotic belief regarding the self or person or objects outside the self that is maintained despite indisputable evidence to the contrary. There are all sorts of delusions, including persecutory delusions, which would be feeling as if people are out to hurt or frame or trick you. Referential delusions, which would be believing public figures are talking directly to you or doing special things for you. Somatic delusions, which would be believing you have a strange health problem or some kind of chronic illness, almost similar to being a hypochondriac. Erotomaniac delusions, that being believing a celebrity or someone random is in love with you, or that your partner or someone is cheating on you all the time. Religious delusions, that being believing you are a holy figure or some type of messiah, or that you're possessed by some type of demon. Grandiose delusions, that being believing you are a major celebrity or someone of importance when you're not. Another aspect of the individual which schizophrenia affects is motor function. Those who suffer from schizophrenia may exhibit signs of being catatonic and not moving at all, or some may be overly active and jittery, performing movements unconsciously. As we know, schizophrenia is not a curable condition, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the world for those affected by it. Schizophrenia can be treated with a number of antipsychotic drugs. These drugs work by altering the effect of certain neurotransmitting chemicals within the brain, such as dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, and acetylcholine. The change in chemicals results in an improvement in mood as well as the suppression of some symptoms. Schizophrenia has quite the history, and we are still learning about it to this day. Maybe someday we will discover the exact cause to the condition. Maybe someday we will learn how to regulate the chemicals in our brain which are causing the disruption, or we will be able to target some genetic mutation that leads to schizophrenia. Until then, modern medicine has granted us enough to be able to somewhat suppress the symptoms for those who suffer. I hope that you have learned something and enjoyed my video presentation for Psych 100. My name is Dante, and thank you for watching.